The story of the Punic Wars is vast and complex, stretching across over a century of relentless conflict, shifting alliances, and profound cultural transformation. To understand their full significance, we must step back and view the grand tapestry woven by the countless events, people, and forces that shaped the Mediterranean world and the course of history. At its heart, the Punic Wars were a monumental clash between two rising powers: Rome, a land-based republic growing in strength and ambition, and Carthage, a maritime empire commanding the wealth of the Western Mediterranean. Their rivalry was not only military, but economic, political, and cultural. The struggle began over Sicily, an island of strategic and economic importance. Rome's ambition to control Sicily led to a prolonged naval conflict with Carthage, whose naval prowess was unmatched at the time. Rome's rapid adaptation, building a powerful fleet, mastering naval warfare, and innovating tactics like the Corvus boarding device, turned the tides. Though costly and exhausting, the war ended with Rome's victory and its first overseas province in Sicily, signaling the Republic's transformation into a Mediterranean power. The Second Punic War is often considered the most dramatic and defining phase of the Punic conflicts. The young and brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca famously marched his army, including war elephants, across the Alps to strike at Rome itself, a feat of audacity and military genius that stunned the ancient world. Hannibal's string of victories, especially the devastating Battle of Cannae, brought Rome to its knees, yet the Republic's resilience endured. Rome's strategy shifted to attrition, harrying Hannibal's allies and undermining Carthage's resources. The turning point came with Scipio Africanus, who took the fight to North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home. At the Battle of Zama, Rome dealt a decisive blow, ending Carthage's hopes of dominance and marking Rome's rise as the unrivaled Mediterranean power. Fueled by lingering fears and political pressure, Rome launched the final campaign against Carthage in the Third Punic War. The siege was brutal and relentless, culminating in the city's utter destruction. The annihilation of Carthage was both a military act and a psychological message. Rome would tolerate no rival. The land once Carthaginian became the Roman province of Africa, a vital granary and economic hub. Yet the Punic spirit lived on in its people, culture, and traditions, blending into the Roman world in complex and lasting ways. Throughout these wars, individual stories reveal the human dimension behind grand history. Hannibal Barca embodies daring leadership and strategic brilliance, yet also the tragedy of a fallen empire. Scipio Africanus represents Roman adaptability and military innovation. Figures like Aelia and Lucius Valerius illustrate the cultural blending and tensions that followed as peoples and identities merged and evolved. Voices like Marcus Claudius Severus remind us of the political and moral dilemmas Rome faced in balancing conquest and governance. Hannas, the Punic farmer, brings to light the social and economic struggles of those living under imperial rule. The Punic Wars reshaped not only territories, but the very structure of Rome, from republic to empire. The wars accelerated Rome's militarization, altered its social fabric, and exposed vulnerabilities that would later fuel internal conflict. Culturally, the wars inspired countless works of literature and art, embedding Hannibal and Carthage into the Western imagination as symbols of courage, tragedy, and the complexity of empire. The Mediterranean itself, transformed from a contested battlefield into a network of interconnected trade, culture, and political influence under Rome's hegemony. The Punic Wars offer timeless lessons about the costs of empire, the resilience of peoples and cultures, and the complexities of identity amid conquest. They remind us that history is not only about victors and vanquished, but about adaptation, survival, and the blending of worlds. The echoes of these wars continue to resonate in how civilizations rise, clash, and evolve, teaching us to look beyond battles, to understand the deeper human stories and legacies that shape our shared past. This reflection invites us to honor the fullness of the Punic Wars story, a narrative of conflict and coexistence, destruction and renewal, history and memory. The salty winds of the central Mediterranean blew across the decks of merchant ships bound for Sicily. The sea, once calm and shared, had begun to feel heavier, tenser, like a breath being held. Beneath the crests of waves and behind the polite exchanges of diplomats, there lingered something deeper, something that no trade agreement, no coin, no offering to the gods could prevent. Rome and Carthage, two great powers, growing ever bolder and ever more entangled in each other's ambitions. But before blades crossed and fleets clashed, the world still knew peace, or something like it. The island of Sicily was the crucible where it all would begin. It was 264 BC, and the city of Messana lay in turmoil. Once a stronghold of the Mamertines, Italian mercenaries, turned rulers of the city, the people now lived in fear of the looming shadow of Hero II, the king of Syracuse. Hero had declared war against them, citing justice, power, and perhaps vengeance as his reasons. But in truth, Messana was a prize, a gateway to the heart of Sicily. Whoever held it could threaten both Carthage's western colonies and Rome's southern territories. The Mamertines, desperate and besieged, turned to the two greatest powers they knew, Rome and Carthage. And so, as dawn broke over the tiled rooftops of Rome, the Senate assembled to hear the plea. The forum was alive with whispers, many doubting the wisdom of sailing across the sea. Rome was still a land-based power, its strength born from legions that marched over mountains and fields, not fleets that rode the waves. Why involve ourselves in the affairs of the Greeks and Sicilians, one senator barked. Because if we don't, another countered, Carthage will. That single sentence rang louder than any horn of war. Carthage, the great maritime empire, ruled from its golden-halled capital in North Africa, stretched across the seas with ports in Iberia, Sardinia, Corsica, and beyond. Their navy was vast, their coffers deep, their ambition no less than Rome's. The Roman people, wary but proud, murmured in the streets as they heard rumors of war across the sea. For many, Sicily was a land of myth and monsters, of Cyclops and the screams of Scylla. But to the Senate, it was opportunity, a test of Roman strength on a new front. Thus, the decision was made. A Roman expedition would cross into Sicily, not just as protectors of Messana, but as challengers to Carthaginian dominance. Meanwhile, in Carthage, the Council of Elders met in chambers, perfumed with incense and cooled with sea breezes. Their spies had already reported Rome's decision. Hasdrubal, a seasoned admiral with salt in his beard and scars beneath his robes, spoke grimly. "They come not to protect Messana," he said, "but to take it from us." The Carthaginian plan was simple. Garrison Messana, use it as a bargaining chip. Show Rome their reach ended at the shores of Italy, but the Romans came quickly. Led by Consul Appius Claudius Caudex, their legions marched with purpose. The sight of Roman soldiers in Sicily was something new. The clinking of their segmented armor, the proud march of their standards, the silent discipline of their ranks. It unnerved allies and enemies alike. Messana welcomed them like saviors. Appius sent envoys to the Carthaginians demanding withdrawal. When none came, battle followed. Steel clashed, and blood stained the Sicilian soil. The First Punic War had begun. But even in this early hour, few could imagine what it would become. Not just a war of generals, but of entire civilizations. It would span over 2 decades, see hundreds of thousands perish, see mighty fleets built, sunk, rebuilt, and sunk again, see elephants march through mountain passes, see cities razed and treaties broken. It would witness the rise of names etched into eternity: Regulus, Hamilcar, Fabius, Hannibal. But for now, it was just the first clash in a long and bitter rivalry. In Messana, the first Roman victory was hard fought. The Carthaginian garrison was driven out, and the Romans took the city for themselves. But in doing so, they had thrown down the gauntlet. Carthage would not retreat so easily. In response, Carthaginian ships blockaded the strait, cutting off supplies. Hero of Syracuse, ever an opportunist, now turned against Rome. Rome found itself trapped in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies. Appius acted with Roman resolve. He marched south, seeking to strike Syracuse and force Hiero to negotiate. The campaign was brutal. The legions, unaccustomed to the unfamiliar terrain and the heat, suffered, but discipline held. Appius reached Syracuse and began a siege, the likes of which the Greeks of the city had rarely seen from Italians. Hiero, sensing that he had underestimated the Roman tenacity, changed course. He sued for peace. Rome accepted. Hiero became an ally of Rome, swearing loyalty and agreeing to supply the Roman war effort. This changed the landscape dramatically. Now, with a foothold in Sicily and a powerful ally, Rome could fight Carthage on equal terms. But Carthage, too, prepared. Admiral Hanno began building a navy unlike anything seen before. Ships with bronze-sheathed rams, crews trained in boarding combat, and sailors raised in the traditions of Phoenician seamanship. They believed they would rule the waves. And yet, Rome surprised them again. The Senate, knowing that fighting Carthage meant fighting on sea, ordered a fleet to be built from scratch. Roman carpenters studied captured Carthaginian ships, learning quickly. But Rome added something new, something that would change naval warfare: the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike at its end. It allowed Roman marines to turn sea battles into infantry skirmishes, playing to Rome's strength. No longer would they have to rely on ramming tactics alone. The first major naval clash came off the coast of Mylae. Rome's consul, Gaius Duilius, commanded the fleet. The Carthaginians laughed at the crude Roman ships, expecting an easy victory. But when the corvus dropped and Roman soldiers surged across the decks like wolves among sheep, the laughter stopped. Carthage lost, dozens of ships captured, thousands taken prisoner. Rome had proven itself a naval power. Back in Rome, celebrations lasted for days. Duilius was honored with a column, still standing centuries later, a testament to a city that refused to bow. But Carthage did not crumble. No, they adapted. New commanders were sent, new fleets built, and the war in Sicily grew bloodier with each passing season. Cities changed hands, armies starved in the hills. Espionage, betrayal, and ambush became commonplace. The Sicilian fields were no longer fertile with grain, but soaked with blood. And all the while, children in Rome and Carthage grew up knowing only war. The First Punic War was no brief conflict. It was a test of will, and neither side was willing to yield. The bronze armor of Roman legions gleamed in the African sun. It was the year 256 BC, nearly 8 years since the war had begun. The war in Sicily had reached a stalemate, neither side gaining ground for long. Rome, growing restless, sought a bold and final stroke, a direct invasion of Carthage itself. The plan was ambitious, unprecedented, and fraught with risk. But the Senate had approved it. If Carthage could be struck at its heart, Perhaps the entire war would collapse from within. So, a fleet was gathered, over 300 warships, thousands of marines, and a commander with unshakable Roman pride, Marcus Atilius Regulus. Regulus was a man of conviction, a traditional Roman of the old mold. He believed in fate, in Rome's manifest destiny, and in victory at any cost. As he stood on the deck of his flagship, looking toward the horizon, he imagined the walls of Carthage falling before him. But Carthage had no intention of letting that happen. The Carthaginian navy, sensing Rome's move, moved to intercept. Off the coast of Ecnomus, one of the greatest naval battles in history was about to begin. The two fleets collided with thunder and steel. Rome's innovative corvus again proved deadly. Carthaginian rams met Roman iron, but where one side sought to destroy ships, the other sought to board and kill. The sea boiled red. Sailors drowned beneath shattered decks. Fires raged across floating corpses. But the Roman formation held. Regulus and his co-consul, Lucius Manlius Vulso, pushed forward. When the blood fog cleared, Rome had won. Over 100 Carthaginian ships were lost. The sea itself seemed Roman now. With the way open, Regulus sailed on to Africa. They landed near Cape Bon, marching inland with confidence. Towns fell one by one, terrified by the sudden Roman presence. Carthaginian armies, scattered and unprepared, were pushed back. Even the mighty city of Tunis was seized. The African campaign had begun in triumph. Regulus, ever the Roman, sent envoys to Carthage, demanding unconditional surrender. The terms were severe: disarmament, tribute, and complete Roman oversight. Carthage refused. They turned to desperation. And from desperation came a name that would one day echo in eternity: Xanthippus. A Greek mercenary commander, experienced in phalanx warfare, brought order to the Carthaginian forces. He trained them, drilled them, gave them purpose again. And most importantly, he introduced a terrifying advantage: war elephants. Regulus, arrogant and unwavering, did not retreat. He met Xanthippus near the Bagradus River. The Roman legions, for all their valor, had never faced beasts like these. As the sun rose, trumpets blared, and the earth trembled, not from cavalry, but from elephants, charging like gods of war. The Roman lines faltered. The corvus was useless here. Swords bounced off thick hides. Trampled soldiers cried out, their formations broken. The phalanx advanced behind the elephants, spears glinting in the sun. Rome lost. It was total. Over 12,000 legionaries died. Regulus was captured. Carthage, reeling from years of defeats, now had a Roman consul in chains. Regulus was thrown into prison, and Rome, shocked, recalled its troops from Africa. The African campaign had turned from triumph to disaster in a matter of weeks. But the war did not end. Far from it. In Sicily, the bloodshed resumed with new fury. Carthage regained confidence. Rome, stung by humiliation, built yet another fleet. But Poseidon, or the gods of fortune, had grown weary of the endless struggle. Storm after storm ravaged Roman ships. In 255 BC, a Roman fleet was destroyed, returning from Africa. Nearly 100,000 sailors drowned. It was one of the worst naval disasters in history. And yet, Rome rebuilt, again and again, as if madness had taken hold. Carthage watched in disbelief. "How many fleets do the Romans have?" one general muttered. "As many as they need," came the reply. The war turned into a grinding endurance contest. The people of Sicily suffered most. Their farms burned, their towns garrisoned, their sons conscripted, their daughters fleeing into the hills. Mercenaries roamed like wolves. Some switched sides when it suited them. And all the while, both Rome and Carthage bled resources, gold, and lives. Years passed. Then came a moment of grim theater. Carthage, seeing no advantage from Regulus' continued imprisonment, sent him back to Rome under oath, not to stay, but to propose a peace treaty in Carthage's favor. If rejected, he had to return. Regulus, now older, gaunt from chains, stepped into the Senate once more. All eyes turned to him. He spoke plainly. "Do not make peace. Do not trust Carthage. They are weakened. We must press on, even if it costs me my life." The Senate was stunned. His voice was hoarse, his skin pale, but his resolve Roman. The treaty was rejected, and Regulus, true to his word, returned to Carthage. He would die in captivity. Some later said they tortured him to death, nailing his eyes open to the sun. Others say he died with dignity. But all agreed he became a martyr of Roman virtue. His name was carved into the hearts of children who would one day fight the sons of Carthage again. The war dragged into its second decade, both powers exhausted, both unwilling to yield. Then in 241 BC, another decisive battle came. Rome yet again built a fleet, this time privately funded by wealthy citizens who believed in victory. Under the command of Gaius Lutatius Catulus, they surprised the Carthaginian navy near the Aegatis Islands. This time, no corvus was needed. Roman sailors had trained harder. They moved faster, fought smarter. The Carthaginian fleet, loaded with supplies and underprepared, collapsed. It was over. Carthage sued for peace. The terms, abandon Sicily, pay a massive indemnity, never again, challenge Rome without permission. Rome accepted. The First Punic War had ended after 23 years of conflict. It was the longest and most brutal war the ancient world had seen to that point. Hundreds of thousands were dead, cities ruined, generations scarred. Rome had won, but at what cost? Carthage had lost Sicily, their jewel, their breadbasket, their foothold in the central Mediterranean. But they had not been broken. In the shadows of defeat, a new power was rising. A young boy, only 9 years old during the surrender, stood in Carthage's temple to Baal and made a vow. His name was Hannibal, and he would make Rome pay for every drop of blood spilled. Carthage had lost, but its heart still beat. In the smoky halls of its council chambers, beneath the blue and gold banners that once flew proudly over Sicily, the air was thick with defeat, but also defiance. The First Punic War was over, but its consequences had only just begun to unfold. The Carthaginian treasury was dry, emptied by years of shipbuilding, mercenary wages, and reparations demanded by the Roman treaty. The coffers of the once wealthy city had turned to dust and debt. And worse still, the soldiers who had bled for Carthage in Sicily, Greek, Numidian, Iberian, Libyan, Balearic, were now stranded, unpaid, and angry. This unrest would become known as the Mercenary War. It was a war not against Rome, but within Carthage itself. In the hills outside the city, fires flickered. Thousands of mercenaries encamped, waiting for payment they had been promised. Their leaders, Spendius, a runaway Roman slave, and Mathos, a Libyan with burning hatred in his heart, organized their ranks, knowing that Carthage had neither gold nor grain to pay them. What had begun as a protest turned into siege. The mercenaries turned on their former employer. They marched on Carthaginian outposts, took towns, and raised a black standard. The people in Carthage panicked. Starvation loomed, and foreign blades were at their gates. But Carthage, wounded though it was, still had one blade left. Hamilcar Barca, a general from the Punic War. Hamilcar had commanded with brilliance and fury. He had never lost a major battle in Sicily, and many believed he could have won the war had Carthage given him more freedom. Now the city turned to him. He accepted reluctantly, not out of love for Carthage's oligarchs, but out of loyalty to the idea of Carthage itself and a burning desire to restore his family's honor. He led his loyal troops out from Carthage and met the mercenary army near the river Bagradas. What followed was a campaign of savage ingenuity. Hamilcar used terrain, speed, and psychological warfare. He lured mercenaries into traps, starved them out, and turned their own leaders against each other. He took no prisoners, there were no treaties, no quarter, no compassion. This was not a war of empire, it was a purge. Spendius was captured. His body was hung high over the battlefield. Mathos followed. Their men were buried in mass graves or crucified along the roads leading to Carthage, hundreds of crosses that lined the dust like a forest of death. The mercenary war had ended. Carthage had survived again, but survival wasn't enough. Hamilcar looked west, to Iberia. Spain, to the Carthaginians, was a land of gold and silver, fierce warriors and rich plains. It was untamed, but it was also an opportunity. Rome now watched Carthage like a hawk. The treaty said nothing about Iberia, so Hamilcar set sail with his family and a small but loyal army. He was not just a general now, he was a king in all but name. Iberia was a place of chaos and tribal rivalries. Celtiberians, Lusitanians, Tartessians, and countless hill clans ruled valleys and mountains, always at war with one another. Hamilcar didn't conquer them all at once. He didn't need to. He married into noble families. He fought decisive but sparing battles. He built alliances and cities, most notably Carthage, New Carthage, a shining coastal jewel that would rival even Carthage itself one day. Silver mines were dug. Carthaginian coinage resumed. And most importantly, Hamilcar raised his sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and the youngest Mago, not in the comforts of the city, but on horseback, in the mud, on the march, under the same sky as the soldiers. He raised them to hate Rome. It is said that one night, before a fire beneath the stars, Hamilcar brought young Hannibal, no older than 9, before the gods. He made the boy swear an oath. Swear to me by the gods of our blood that you will never be a friend of Rome. The boy placed his hand upon the altar and spoke the words that would change history. I swear. Rome, meanwhile, had not rested. Though victorious, they were wary. They watched Carthage's moves in Iberia with growing unease. They had taken Sicily, and after a brief struggle, Sardinia and Corsica too, opportunistically when Carthage was weak during the mercenary revolt. Carthage had protested, but Rome had threatened war. It was a bitter pill. Carthage paid another indemnity, but the resentment it bred was far deeper than coin. Rome had also changed during this time. Their fleet, once an experiment, was now standard. They built roads across Italy, strengthened alliances, and turned the Mediterranean into their personal lake of influence. But for all their power, they didn't understand the storm brewing in the west. Hamilcar died in 228 BC, drowned while crossing a river during a campaign against a rebellious Iberian tribe. His legacy, however, lived on in his sons. Hasdrubal the Fair, Hannibal's brother-in-law, took command next. He was a diplomat as much as a general. Under him, Carthage signed a treaty with Rome, the Ebro Treaty, stating that Carthage would not expand north of the Ebro River in Spain. Rome thought they had contained them. But then came Saguntum, a wealthy Iberian city south of the Ebro, but allied to Rome in spirit, if not in writing. In 221 BC, Hasdrubal was assassinated, and the army turned to Hannibal. He was 25, but he had already fought in sieges, crossed mountains, and crushed Iberian rebels. He was charismatic, loved by soldiers, and feared by enemies. His mind was as sharp as his sword. His presence commanded obedience, and he hated Rome with every fiber of his being. He did not move against Saguntum immediately. He built further, securing tribes, training elephants, deepening his supply lines. He studied Roman tactics and terrain. He prepared not just for war, but for something greater. In 219 BC, Hannibal marched on Saguntum. It was a message, not just a campaign. Rome protested, but Carthage, under pressure from Hannibal's rising popularity, did nothing. Saguntum fell after a bloody siege. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage refused. War was declared. But no one in Rome expected what came next. They thought he would defend Spain, maybe sail to Sicily again. Another Sicilian campaign, perhaps. They were wrong. Hannibal did something no one had done since Pyrrhus. He decided to invade Italy, not by sea, but by land. He would cross the Pyrenees, march through Gaul, and take his elephants, his war beasts, over the Alps, into the heart of Roman territory. It was madness. It was genius. It was the beginning of the Second Punic War. And for Rome, the darkest years were still ahead. The wind screamed through the icy peaks, high above the world, where the rocks turned to ice and the clouds scraped against the jagged edges of mountains. A foreign army crept forward, a snake of men, horses, and monstrous shapes, half hidden by snow. The Alps had broken many men before. They had crushed armies, devoured travelers, and laughed at the dreams of kings. But this was Hannibal Barca, and he was not like other men. It was late autumn of 218 BC. Rome had declared war, but Hannibal would not wait for them to bring it to Iberia. He would take the war to their doorstep, drag it across rivers, through forests, over mountains, and into the very marrow of Italy. His plan was audacious, a feat never attempted on such scale. He began with over 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and around 37 elephants. By the time he reached the base of the Alps, he had already fought dozens of battles, crossed the treacherous Pyrenees, and subdued hostile Gallic tribes. His army had dwindled from skirmishes and desertion. Supplies were low. Winter was near. But he pressed on. Each night, around the campfires, his officers whispered concerns. "This is suicide," muttered one. "The men will freeze before they ever fight." Hannibal would say nothing at first. He would simply walk among them, his cloak soaked with snow, his eyes hard as granite. And then, standing before a fire, he would raise his voice. "Rome thinks we are animals, that we are incapable of suffering as they do, that we are not equal to their legions. Let us prove to them that we are more." And so they climbed. The Alpine tribes watched in awe. No one had seen such a force in these mountains. At first they offered trade, food for safety, but many of them were liars, treacherous beyond measure. They led Carthaginian units into ambushes, rolled boulders down cliffs, rained arrows from above. Hannibal adapted quickly. He divided his army into smaller units, using light Iberian skirmishers to scout ahead. He burned tree barriers, hacked through ice with fire-hardened tools, and even negotiated temporary alliances when possible. But the mountain gods were not kind. Storms battered them, mules slipped into chasms, elephants panicked and slid down icy slopes. Men lost fingers to frostbite. Some fell asleep in the snow and never awoke. It is said that at one point, Hannibal himself nearly died, his horse stumbling on a narrow pass as Carthaginian and Gallic enemies fought just feet away. But after over 2 weeks of hell, Hannibal and what remained of his army emerged on the other side. They were a ghost of what had entered. Fewer than 26,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and only a few elephants survived. But they had done the impossible. They had crossed the Alps, and now they stood in the northern plains of Italy. No Roman army had expected this. In Rome, panic spread through the Senate like fire through dry grass. "They came through the Alps? That's madness," cried one senator. "They will burn every field, sack every village. We must meet them at once." Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been on his way to Spain to confront Hannibal, reversed course. He raced north, hoping to stop the Carthaginian tide. But Hannibal was faster. At the Ticino River, Hannibal's cavalry struck first, swift Numidian horsemen swarming Roman scouts, scattering them like dust. Scipio himself was wounded and barely escaped with his life. Rome now knew this was not just a raid, it was an invasion. Shortly after, Hannibal met the Romans again, this time at the Trebia River. The consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, eager for glory, crossed the icy river to meet him, thinking the Carthaginians were weakened and tired. Hannibal had been waiting. He had hidden forces in the tall reeds and soaked plains. As the Romans attacked his front, his brother Mago struck from behind with a surprise ambush. Caught between the freezing river and Hannibal's trap, the Roman army collapsed. Thousands died, their armor dragging them under the water. The survivors fled in disarray. It was Hannibal's first great victory on Italian soil, and the Italian people, especially the Gauls of the Po Valley, noticed. Many of them joined him. To them, Rome was an oppressor. Hannibal was a liberator. But the road ahead was still long. The Romans, though beaten, were not broken. They had seen Pyrrhus come and go. They knew how to endure. Rome began recruiting new armies, conscripting farmers, blacksmiths, and even boys. Cities were fortified, roads patrolled. They appointed new consuls for the following year, Gaius Flaminius and Gnaeus Servilius Geminus. And still, Hannibal pressed on. He marched south, toward the heart of the Republic. In 217 BC, Hannibal reached Lake Trasimene, a misty body of water surrounded by low hills and forested slopes. It was here that he laid his most brilliant trap yet. He learned Flaminius was approaching in haste, burning to reclaim Roman honor. Hannibal knew the man was reckless, so he positioned his forces in a crescent. Hidden behind ridges and forest, he left a small force in plain sight on the road. Flaminius took the bait. At dawn, as fog blanketed the lake, the Roman column marched along the road. They saw Hannibal's troops and charged, thinking they had caught him unprepared. Then the horns sounded. From every side, Carthaginian troops erupted from the hills. The Roman army was crushed before it could even form ranks. Men drowned in the lake, horses bolted into the mist. Flaminius was killed in the chaos, struck down by Gallic blades. It was the largest ambush in military history. Over 15,000 Romans died that day. Hannibal's legend spread like wildfire. He was called the Monster of Carthage, the Shadow from the Alps, and even by some Roman poets, the Sword of Vengeance. But he never sacked Rome. Not yet. Instead, he moved further south, gathering more allies, weakening Rome's grip on its own territories. Still, the Romans refused to break. They appointed a man not of action, but of caution, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was no fool. He had studied Hannibal. He knew that rushing into battle meant death, so he changed the rules. He avoided open conflict, burned crops ahead of Hannibal, blocked roads, starved the Carthaginians slowly, like a wolf circling a lion. The Romans called it cowardice, but Fabius knew it was the only way, and it began to work. Hannibal, unable to force a battle, began to suffer. Supplies ran thin. His allies grew restless, but Rome grew impatient. They replaced Fabius the next year, and Hannibal waited. The new consuls in 216 BC were Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They raised the largest army in Roman history, nearly 90,000 men, and they met Hannibal on the flat plains of Cannae, the perfect place for Roman discipline, or so they thought. Hannibal arranged his forces in a crescent, weakest in the center, strongest on the flanks. As the Roman army surged forward, they pushed the center back, thinking they were winning. Then Hannibal's flanks closed in. Then his cavalry, led by Maharbal, struck the Roman rear. It was a slaughter. Over 50,000 Romans died in one day. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. And yet, Rome still stood. But now, for the first time, she was afraid. Allies defected. Towns surrendered. The road to Rome was open. Still, Hannibal did not march on the city. No one knows why. Some say his army was too weak. Others say the city's walls were too strong. Or perhaps Hannibal knew that to destroy Rome, he needed more than soldiers. He needed its soul to break. And Rome, though bleeding, still had its soul. The red earth of Italy had soaked in so much Roman blood that it seemed the land itself mourned. Cannae, that name alone could freeze the bravest heart. Rome had suffered her greatest catastrophe, an annihilation not just of men, but of faith, of pride, of certainty. 50,000 dead, thousands more taken prisoner, and entire legions erased from the records of life. In the Forum, silence reigned. There were no cries for revenge, no public mourning. The city wore a mask of iron discipline, but its people trembled behind closed doors. Black veils hung from doorways. Funeral pyres burned day and night. Mothers could no longer cry. Their tears had dried from overuse. And yet, Rome did not surrender. It was a lesson Hannibal would come to understand well. Rome was not just a city, nor just a people. It was a machine, ancient and unyielding, fed by discipline, cruelty, and a will to endure the unendurable. Even in the face of utter disaster, Rome recruited again. Slaves were offered freedom to fight. Orphans, boys barely able to lift a gladius, were conscripted. Gladiators were unshackled. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, was enacted to preserve order at all costs. Rome no longer fought for victory. Now it fought for survival. Hannibal, in contrast, was the undisputed master of Italy. After Cannae, cities in the south began to fall like dominoes. Capua, the second greatest city in the peninsula, opened its gates to him. Tarentum, Metapontum, Locri, all turned against their former Roman masters. In the Senate chambers of Carthage, praise and jealousy mingled like wine and vinegar. "Give him reinforcements," cried some. "He seeks to be a king in Italy," warned others. Still, support was slow. Hannibal had planned well, but Italy was vast and its cities well fortified. Rome's allies in central Italy remained stubbornly loyal. Hannibal's army, though victorious, was worn thin. His elephants were dead. His men, veterans now of years-long war, were hardened but weary. And worst of all, Carthage failed to send real reinforcements. Whether through internal politics, mistrust of the Barcid family, or simple short-sightedness, Carthage squandered its greatest advantage. Hannibal could not take Rome, and Rome, though battered, had time. In that time, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, the delayer, was recalled to prominence. His strategy of avoiding pitched battle, harassing supply lines, and starving Hannibal's progress had once been mocked. Now it was gospel. His methods did not win glory, but they bought Rome its future. Hannibal found himself dragged into sieges he couldn't win, ambushes in unfamiliar terrain, and a growing web of Roman informants and allies tightening around his position. Each year, the war in Italy grew colder, more cautious, more strategic. It was no longer a dance of swords, but a war of attrition. And then came Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was but a boy when Hannibal had crossed the Alps. His father, a Roman general, had nearly died at the Ticinus River. Scipio himself had saved his father's life that day, cutting through a swarm of Numidian cavalry and dragging him to safety. He had seen war, and he had not flinched. After Cannae, He was among the survivors. While senators panicked and Rome grieved, the young Scipio rallied soldiers. He stood before the altar of Jupiter and made a vow. "By the gods, I will bring down Hannibal." In 211 BC, Rome suffered another blow. Capua, Hannibal's greatest ally in Italy, was besieged by Roman forces. Hannibal marched to relieve it, trying to force a confrontation. But Fabius and his colleagues refused to engage. So Hannibal marched on Rome itself. He reached the gates. He burned the fields. He raided the outskirts. He threw javelins at the very walls of the city. But Rome did not break. Its gates remained closed. Its people did not panic. In fact, the Senate continued meeting within sight of the Carthaginian camp. This was Rome's answer to Hannibal. It would not die from fear. Capua fell. The message was clear. Hannibal could not protect his allies. The tide had turned. Meanwhile, in Iberia, a new front had opened. The Scipio family had long been engaged there, attempting to cut off Carthage's lifeline, its mines, its mercenaries, its Iberian allies. But they were outmatched by Carthaginian commanders Hasdrubal Pasha, Hannibal's brother, Mago, and the brilliant Hasdrubal Gisco. In 211 BC, both Scipio brothers were killed in ambushes. The Roman forces in Iberia collapsed. It seemed Iberia might be lost, but Rome, desperate for leadership, turned to the young Scipio. He was only 25. He had no official rank, no army, but he had resolve. He took command. And the war in Iberia would never be the same. Scipio Africanus, as he would later be called, did not fight like a traditional Roman general. He studied Hannibal, he respected him, and in doing so, he adopted many of Hannibal's tactics: ambush, deception, speed, mobility. In 209 BC, Scipio launched a bold strike on New Carthage, the heart of Carthaginian Spain. It was supposed to be impregnable. Scipio attacked it by sea and land at once, with such speed and precision that the defenders were overwhelmed. New Carthage fell. Rome now controlled Carthage's richest city in Iberia. More importantly, Scipio had proven he was not just a politician's son. He was a warlord of vision. Over the next 4 years, he defeated Hasdrubal Pasha, Mago, and their armies in a string of brilliant engagements. He used fire attacks, night raids, and psychological warfare. His troops loved him. His enemies feared him. Iberian tribes shifted their allegiance to Rome. By 206 BC, Carthage was pushed entirely out of Spain. Now Scipio turned his eyes to Africa. Back in Italy, Hannibal's position had grown desperate. He still won battles, still raided, still defied Roman attempts to trap him. But he was now a lion, cut off from his pride. His brothers had died or retreated. His allies were few. His army was old, reduced to a core of veterans who remembered the Alps, but felt their strength fading. Even in southern Italy, support for him waned. Rome had bled for 15 years, but it had endured. Now it wanted to finish what it started. Scipio returned to Rome and demanded the impossible. "Send me to Africa. Let me end the war." The Senate hesitated, but Scipio had become too powerful, too beloved. The people trusted him. The army adored him. And more importantly, he was winning. So, in 204 BC, Scipio set sail for Carthage, Africa, the Carthaginian homeland. Scipio moved with speed and brutality. He allied with Massinissa, a prince of Numidia who had been betrayed by Carthage years before. With Numidian cavalry and Roman legions, Scipio laid waste to Carthaginian allies. The city of Utica was besieged. Fields burned. Carthage was suddenly vulnerable. The Senate of Carthage, now in panic, did what it had avoided for years. They recalled Hannibal. After 16 years in Italy, Hannibal returned home. He stepped off the ship as a legend, but he found a city crippled by fear. He was 45 now, older, battle-worn, and surrounded by politics. He no longer commanded fresh troops or endless elephants. What he had was what was left: recruits, old veterans, a few mercenaries. But it was enough. He would face Scipio. The final act was set. In a wide open field near the town of Zama, two titans would meet. Hannibal Barca, the master of strategy, the terror of Rome. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the avenger of Cannae, the architect of Africa's fall. Rome and Carthage, the eagle and the lion, would fight not just for victory, but for survival. The world held its breath. The earth trembled with the sound of hooves. Thousands of horses stirred the dust under the African sun, their riders armored in gleaming bronze and polished leather. Behind them, the steady thunder of marching feet pounded like a war drum. Legions of Rome, veterans of Iberia and Sicily, now united under a single banner, a single purpose, and a single man. Scipio, the eagle of Rome. Ahead, across the vast plain, near a village called Zama, stood the man whose shadow had loomed over Rome for nearly 2 decades. The man who had crossed the Alps, crushed armies, and shaken the foundations of the Republic. Hannibal Barca, the lion of Carthage. He waited in silence, surveying the field from horseback. He had returned home to a different world, one not of conquest and glory, but of desperation. His homeland was no longer the confident, glittering city of trade and navy supremacy. It was now a city of aging counselors, hollow speeches, and broken promises. But he still had one battle left, and one enemy left to face. The days before Zama were filled with unease. Both generals knew this was not just a battle, it was the end. Either Hannibal would reverse the tide of Carthage's collapse and shatter Rome's rising hegemony, or Scipio would finish what had begun over 20 years ago, what Regulus, Fabius, and countless Roman dead had tried to do. And so, in a gesture rare among commanders, Hannibal and Scipio met in person the day before the battle. Under a tent outside the field, no weapons, no soldiers, just two minds forged in the fires of war. They greeted one another, not as enemies, but as equals. Hannibal, older and lined with age, studied the Roman across the table. "You have done well, Scipio," he said. "You have taken Iberia, brought war to my city. I did not expect to see the day Rome would raise a man like you." Scipio, calm and polite, replied, "And I did not expect to face the man who once stood at our gates. Yet here we are." They discussed peace, but both knew the truth. There would be no treaty. Too much had been lost. Too many cities burned. Too many bones buried beneath the soil. The war would end, but only with one of them dead or defeated. They stood, saluted each other like soldiers, and parted. The morning of the battle, October 210 BC. Hannibal had assembled what he could, around 40,000 men, a mix of Carthaginian citizens, Numidian mercenaries, and raw recruits. He had also scrounged together 80 war elephants, the last remnants of Carthage's once mighty war beast corps. Scipio had slightly fewer men, about 35,000 infantry and 4,500 cavalry, but they were veterans. Many had fought under his command for years. They had taken New Carthage, survived the deserts of Africa, and were now hardened into one of the deadliest armies Rome had ever fielded. The Roman right wing was bolstered by a powerful ally, Massinissa, the Numidian prince and former Carthaginian ally, now sworn to Rome. His cavalry was fast, disciplined, and burning with vengeance for his exile. Scipio's formation was unconventional. Instead of placing his maniples tightly together in Roman checkerboard, he left wide lanes between each unit. Hannibal saw it, and he understood. Scipio was inviting his elephants forward. The horns sounded. Hannibal raised his arm, and the elephants charged. The ground quaked. The beasts surged forward, massive and thundering, their tusks wrapped in iron, their handlers urging them into Roman lines. But the Romans didn't brace. They opened the lanes. Trumpets blared, javelins flew. Some elephants were skewered, others veered off, confused by noise and fire. Some crashed through the lanes harmlessly, then turned and trampled their own rear lines in a frenzy. What should have broken Roman ranks failed. Then came the infantry clash. Hannibal's first two lines, mercenaries and African conscripts, rushed forward. The Romans met them with shields locked, pillar thrown, bloody drawn. The fight was savage. Scipio ordered his men to hold, not advance. He let the first two Carthaginian lines exhaust themselves. When Hannibal sent his third line, his veteran Italian campaigners, Scipio pulled his maniples back slightly, regrouping into tighter formations. The Roman line held. Then Massinissa returned. He and Laelius, Scipio's cavalry commander, had driven off the Carthaginian horse earlier in the day. Now they returned from behind the hills, crashing into the Carthaginian rear. Hannibal's veterans fought like lions, but they were surrounded, pinned from the front by Roman infantry, smashed from the back by Numidian horsemen. The line broke, men screamed, sand turned red, bodies fell in heaps, and Hannibal, watching from the rear, knew. It was over. He escaped death. Scipio, ever the tactician, did not pursue him. Instead, he marched on Carthage, offering peace on Roman terms. The terms were brutal. Carthage would surrender its navy. Carthage would pay a vast war indemnity, 10,000 talents over 50 years. Carthage could not wage war without Roman permission. All elephants and prisoners were to be handed over. Massinissa would reclaim Numidia. Carthage had no choice. The Senate voted to accept. The Second Punic War was over. After 17 years, the greatest conflict the ancient world had ever seen ended not with the sack of a city, but with the quiet signature of defeat. Scipio returned to Rome a hero. He was awarded the name Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. But he did not celebrate wildly. He knew what had been lost. He had seen the bones of legions at Cannae, heard the cries of soldiers dying in the sands of Iberia. He knew Hannibal would forever haunt Rome's memory. And what of Hannibal? He lived on, but not as a general. He became a politician in Carthage, trying to reform the corrupt aristocracy that had abandoned him. But Rome feared him still. They demanded his exile. He fled, becoming a wandering advisor to Eastern kings, fighting against Roman influence wherever he could, always one step ahead of capture. Eventually, surrounded and hunted, he took poison. "Let us relieve the Romans of their fears," he is said to have muttered. "They will never know peace while I live." And so, the lion fell. Carthage was humbled. Rome stood supreme. But peace was only an illusion, because deep in Roman hearts, a seed had been planted, not of victory, but of paranoia. They had defeated Hannibal, but they had not forgotten him. Nor would they ever forgive Carthage for the fear he had caused. One day, that fear would bloom into flame, and Carthage would burn. The fires of war had been extinguished, but the coals still glowed. Rome stood tall in the aftermath of the Second Punic War. It had outlasted the most brilliant general in history, weathered defeat after defeat, and emerged bloodied but victorious. The city of 7 hills, once a modest republic on the Italian peninsula, was now the undisputed power of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage, meanwhile, had survived, but not truly lived. The peace treaty signed at Zama in 202 BC was more than just a surrender, it was a sentence. Under the iron terms imposed by Scipio Africanus, Carthage was forbidden from declaring war without Rome's explicit permission, even in self-defense. The great Punic navy was dismantled. Only 10 triremes remained. symbolic shadows of the once mighty fleet that had ruled the waves. Its war elephants were taken, its wealth drained, and every year the city was forced to send silver, 200 talents annually for 50 years, a constant reminder of their chains. But more damaging than the terms was what they left behind. Hannibal Barca returned to Carthage not as a conqueror, but as a statesman. Though defeated, he had not been humiliated. Many in Carthage still revered him. Veterans kissed his hands. Mothers showed him their fatherless sons and said, "He died following you." And Hannibal, though worn by war, remained fiercely intelligent. He now turned his eyes not to foreign fields, but to the rotting halls of Carthage's own government. The Council of Elders, long ruled by oligarchic families, had grown fat, corrupt, and complacent. These men had refused him reinforcements during the war. They had hoarded wealth and influence while the Republic bled. So Hannibal ran for office and won. He became suffete, the highest magistrate in Carthage, and immediately launched a campaign of reform. He restructured the tax system, ending favoritism and ensuring the wealthy paid their fair share. He erased corruption, establishing annual reviews of magistrates and banishing those who had profited off war. He began to revive Carthaginian commerce, rebuilding the merchant fleet, restoring the harbors, and re-establishing trade routes across Africa and the Levant. Carthage began to rise again, not through war, but through order. But that rising worried someone: Rome. In the Senate halls, the name Hannibal still echoed like a ghost. Some senators admired him as a worthy opponent, but others, especially veterans of the war, hated him with a cold, irrational fear. Chief among them was Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder. He was a man of stern virtue, old Roman ideals, and absolute conviction. To him, Hannibal's survival, his mere existence, was an offense to Roman dignity. Cato began a campaign of paranoia. Every time he stood in the Senate, no matter the subject, he ended his speeches with the same chilling phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. At first, senators chuckled, but he never stopped. For 10 years he repeated it, until laughter became nods, and nods became murmurs, and murmurs became plans. Rome could not attack Carthage outright. The treaty stood in the way. Carthage had not broken any terms, but if Rome could not find a cause, it would create one. And so they turned to Numidia. King Massinissa, Rome's loyal ally in Africa, had ambitions of his own. He claimed territories near Carthage, accusing them of violating his sovereignty. With Roman approval, he began attacking Punic settlements. Carthage petitioned the Senate to intervene. Rome refused. Massinissa continued his raids, burning farms, enslaving villagers, annexing fertile land. The people of Carthage, starving and desperate, begged their government to fight back. The council, wary of Roman retaliation, hesitated. But after one particularly brutal raid in 151 BC, something broke. The Carthaginians mobilized an army. They repelled the Numidians. They had no choice. To do nothing was death. But in doing so, they had broken the treaty, and Rome had its cause. The Senate convened in fury. Cato's voice rang out above all others. Has Hannibal not taught us what happens when we allow Carthage to live? They will always rise again. They will always threaten us. There can be no peace while they breathe. A formal declaration of war was issued. Carthage, sensing what was to come, panicked. They sent envoys to Rome, offering full surrender. We will hand over our army, our navy, our gold, whatever you demand. Rome responded coldly. Send us 300 noble children as hostages. Carthage complied. They thought that would be enough. Then Rome sent 80,000 soldiers under Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of Scipio Africanus. Once the hostages were secured, Rome made its final demand. Carthage must be destroyed, not occupied, not ruled, destroyed. You must burn your city and move inland. You are forbidden to live within 30 miles of the sea. The Carthaginian envoys stood in stunned silence. One fell to his knees, another tore his robes. The final war had begun. In Carthage, the Senate wept, the people rioted. But from that chaos came unity. For the first time in a generation, Carthage stood together. Former rivals clasped hands. Elders took up arms. Women prepared stones and boiling oil. Children learned to make arrows. The city refused to die. They built weapons in secret. They forged armor from temple doors. They melted statues to make spearheads. In the docks, shipbuilders resurrected a fleet from shattered wood and old blueprints. Rome had expected surrender. Instead, they met resistance. The siege of Carthage began in 149 BC. It would last 3 years. Scipio Aemilianus, young and untested, was given full command. The Romans built a massive wall to encircle the city. They cut off food and water. They burned nearby fields. They captured outlying forts. But Carthage held. The defenders fought like demons. They launched nightly raids, burned Roman camps, sank siege towers. They built new weapons daily, sometimes using leather and papyrus when iron ran out. Inside the walls, starvation set in. Families ate rats. Some turned to the dead. Still, they did not surrender. In 146 BC, Rome broke through. Scipio ordered a full assault. Street by street, the Romans fought. Every house became a fortress, every alley a killing field. Carthaginians fought with kitchen knives, tools, even bricks. Women threw flaming oil from rooftops. Children fought alongside fathers. Scipio watched the carnage with horror. He wept at the destruction. He quoted Homer, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish." When the fires finally stopped, Carthage no longer existed. Its walls were razed. Its people, those not killed, were sold into slavery. Its land was cursed, and according to legend, salted, so nothing would grow again. Rome now ruled the entire Western Mediterranean. The last threat was gone. And yet, something had been lost. Carthage had been an empire of merchants, philosophers, and explorers. Their ships had mapped the coasts of Africa. Their thinkers had studied the stars. Their legacy, though hated by Rome, had shaped the ancient world. And Hannibal, the ghost who had haunted Rome, was gone forever. But Rome could not forget him, because the more powerful Rome became, the more it feared becoming what it had destroyed. Rome had won. The city of Carthage no longer stood. Its libraries turned to smoke, its palaces to rubble, its people to dust or slaves. The fire that once lit North Africa's coast, with wealth, knowledge, and maritime brilliance, had been snuffed out, deliberately and without mercy. The Third Punic War was over. And yet, as the black smoke rose over the ruins of Carthage in 146 BC, not all in Rome cheered. Some whispered uneasily, wondering what had been born in those flames. Because in destroying its greatest rival, Rome had destroyed its last mirror. There was no one left to fear. And that made Rome fear itself. Scipio Aemilianus, the man who had leveled Carthage, stood alone amid the wreckage. The son by adoption of Scipio Africanus, he had fulfilled his bloodline's destiny. But when asked if he felt pride, he said nothing. Instead, he walked among the ruins in silence, past corpses, shattered idols, and the broken remnants of a once proud city. He was seen weeping. A soldier approached him, saying, "You have done what your grandfather could not. You have saved Rome." But Scipio shook his head and quoted Homer, the lament of the Trojan queen Hecuba. "Even the mighty walls of Rome shall fall, His words chilled those who heard them. Rome had destroyed Carthage, but it had also unleashed something darker, an appetite that would grow with every conquest, every foreign war, and every march of legionaries into foreign lands. Carthage's territory was annexed into the Roman Republic, becoming the province of Africa. This was a new concept, not simply allies or client states, but direct rule from Rome. A governor was installed, Roman law imposed, Latin settlements spread like vines across the African coast. Rome had tasted the power of empire, and it liked it. But with victory came contradictions. The same Senate that had wept over the deaths at Cannae now reveled in blood. Men like Cato were dead, but their philosophy endured. Expansion, superiority, and total domination. Those who once fought wars to defend Italy now began wars to expand Italy. Spain, Gaul, Greece, Asia Minor, they were next. Inside Rome, the costs of war were not just counted in gold, but in identity. The veterans who had fought for years in Iberia or Africa returned home to find their farms in ruins, sold to wealthy elites or abandoned. The aristocracy had bought up land and used slaves, many from Carthage, to work it cheaply. A new class of landless citizens emerged, the urban poor, angry, hungry, and disillusioned. They had fought for Rome, and now Rome ignored them. Into this fracture stepped new voices. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, rose decades later to reform land laws, giving territory back to the poor. They cited the Roman virtues of old, the mos maiorum, but they also cited Carthage. Are we not becoming what we destroyed? Gaius once asked the Senate. Shall we hoard wealth like the Carthaginians and turn Rome into a city of slaves and merchants? They were both killed. Their blood marked a new Roman age, an age of civil unrest, of political assassinations, and of revolutions in togas. But amid all this change, one name remained unspoken but ever-present: Hannibal. Children still heard stories of him to keep them awake at night. Senators debated war as if he were still lurking beyond the Alps. The name Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became a Roman phrase for panic, used whenever the state faced crisis. But more than fear, there was admiration. Many Roman generals studied his tactics. Scipio Africanus, before Zama, had openly praised Hannibal's genius. In the Roman military academies of the later Republic, Hannibal's strategies were taught alongside Roman victories. Julius Caesar himself, upon crossing the Rubicon, was said to have kept notes of Hannibal's campaigns. Rome had destroyed his body, but his mind lived on. With Carthage gone, there were no checks on Rome's expansion. In 146 BC, the same year Carthage fell, so too did Corinth, the jewel of Greece. Rome burned that city as well, ending Greek independence. Now Rome controlled not just the Western Mediterranean, but the Eastern too. Egypt remained independent for now, but its days were numbered. What followed was a century of near-constant warfare, political chaos, and ambition. Marius reformed the army, allowing landless poor to join, creating loyal personal armies. Sulla marched on Rome itself. Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar turned the Republic into a contest of titans. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, declared himself dictator, and was stabbed for it. And in time, his heir, Octavian, would become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. By 27 BC, the Roman Republic, once the proud rival of Carthage, was dead. An empire had risen, and Carthage was part of what made that possible. In later years, some Roman philosophers would wonder if Carthage had been necessary. Cicero, writing generations after the wars, reflected, "We learn more from our enemies than our friends. Carthage made us strong. Its absence may make us soft." Others agreed. Without Carthage, there were no more worthy foes. Rome became paranoid, turning its legions inward. Generals fought generals. Civil war followed civil war. Provinces rebelled. Even emperors feared their own armies. Some, like Caligula, became mad with power. Others, like Nero, burned the very heart of the city. In the end, Rome, like Carthage, would face its own decline. And when the Vandals, centuries later, arrived to plunder the remains of the empire, they did so from North Africa, from the very land once ruled by Carthage. History, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. But though Carthage was gone, it was not forgotten. Its legacy lived on in language, trade, and memory. Hannibal's tactics were studied for millennia. Its harbors were rebuilt by the Romans, and centuries later, by Byzantines. Even today, beneath the city of modern-day Tunis, archaeologists find shards of Punic pottery, fragments of walls, coins etched with the face of Baal or the sigil of Tanit. Whispers of a world that once rivaled Rome. The war had ended, but the peace was uneasy. Though Rome stood triumphant in the Mediterranean world, it carried deep, invisible scars, etched into the bones of its people, into the minds of its veterans, and into the very laws that governed the Republic. The Punic Wars had changed everything. They had remade Rome into an empire without a crown. And now, without an enemy, the city began to unravel from within. The survivors of the Third Punic War, those who had marched under Scipio Aemilianus, returned to a Rome richer than ever, but colder, more brutal, and less Roman in spirit. For some, there were triumphs, land grants, and coin. For others, especially the common soldiers, there was nothing but dust, fading memories, and a city that had moved on without them. The farms they had once tended were now owned by aristocrats. The countryside they had bled to protect was carved up into vast estates, worked by slaves, captured in Carthage and Greece. The legionaries walked through the city like ghosts, proud but bitter. They had won the war, yet they had returned to find themselves strangers in the republic they had defended. The veterans' unrest grew. Taverns swelled with their voices. Grizzled men swapping tales of Africa and Iberia, of Hannibal's elephants and Scipio's fire. Many began to question whether Rome had truly won, or merely traded one master for another. They spoke of their generals with admiration, but whispered darkly of the Senate. The senators had not fought, they said. They had merely counted coins, while others had died. And among the Roman elite, paranoia began to take root. The memory of Hannibal still lingered, not as a threat, but as a standard. Every general now measured himself against him. Every military campaign bore his shadow. Hannibal had dared to do what no one else had done, challenge Rome at its heart, and nearly win. That image, that legend, haunted the dreams of ambitious men and tormented the conscience of cautious senators. The aristocrats began to fear their own commanders. The legions, once loyal to the Republic, were now more loyal to those who led them. The state had created its own monsters, soldiers who loved their generals more than their city. This was the legacy of Hannibal. Not just a war, but a transformation in how Rome understood power. But what of the Carthaginians who had survived? Those few who escaped the sack, who lived on in exile, scattered across Africa and the wider world, carried not just memories, but grief. A grief so vast that it passed into legend. The survivors became traders, scribes, and craftsmen in other lands. In Egypt, some found refuge. In Numidia, others were sold into slavery. A few even served in distant armies, concealing their origins. But their hearts remained in Carthage, and they whispered its name in the darkness. They remembered the scent of the harbor, the shine of bronze on the temples, the smell of spices on the wind. They spoke of Hannibal in reverent tones, not as a mere general, but as the last lion of their people. Children born in exile were told stories of the city with walls so strong they had once repelled the gods. Some even vowed that Carthage would rise again. Rome had tried to erase the Punic legacy. It forbade their language, destroyed their temples, rewrote their history. But memory is stubborn, and suffering has a long memory. Meanwhile, in the heart of Rome, the Senate grew more rigid. The wars had taught them that disunity was dangerous. Debate began to diminish. Power concentrated in fewer hands. The aristocracy, emboldened by conquest, sought to control every aspect of Roman life, from trade and taxes to marriage laws and land ownership. This rigidity led to rebellion. The Gracchi brothers, grandsons of Scipio Africanus by blood, rose with bold reform agendas. They wanted land returned to the poor. They wanted grain distributed fairly. They wanted to curb the Senate's power. And for their efforts, they were both killed, first Tiberius, then Gaius, cut down by mobs orchestrated by the Senate itself. Their deaths marked a line from which Rome would never return. Political violence had arrived. It would not leave. And the Carthaginian example lingered as both warning and temptation. Destroy your enemies or be destroyed. That was the lesson of Carthage. The Republic took it to heart, and with every internal conflict, Rome began to devour itself. In the decades that followed, new warlords emerged. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, men who sought glory not through the Senate, but through conquest. They raised armies of their own, loyal not to Rome, but to them. They promised their soldiers land, gold, and immortality, just as Hannibal had once done. They waged wars far from Italy, in Gaul, in Pontus, in Britannia, and brought back slaves, riches, and fame. But with each victory, Rome slipped further from what it had been. The Senate became a figurehead. The people became restless. The army became a kingmaker. And Julius Caesar, crossing the Rubicon in 49 BC, uttered words that echoed the boldness of Hannibal's own Alpine crossing. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. The Republic fell. Not with a siege, not with a sack, but with the applause of a people who no longer knew what a republic truly was. Caesar crowned himself dictator for life. He was assassinated, but the damage was done. Rome was no longer a republic of equals. It was now an empire of emperors. And deep in its foundations, beneath the marble and gold, lay the ghost of Carthage. The city that once rivaled Rome had left behind no walls, no ships, no legions, but it had left behind an idea that power, once taken, is never willingly surrendered, that fear can build empires, that memory is stronger than stone. Rome tried to forget Carthage, but it could not, because in every act of cruelty, in every conquest, in every whisper of war, the Republic repeated what it had done to Carthage. And so Carthage lived on, not in ruins, but in Rome's very blood. Though Carthage lay in ashes, its spirit was far from extinguished. The brutal fire Rome had unleashed upon the city had reduced temples to rubble and sent countless souls into oblivion. But beneath the charred stones, a new story began, one of survival, adaptation, and transformation. The Roman Republic, flush with victory, quickly set about turning the fallen Carthaginian Empire into a province, Africa Proconsularis. Roman governors replaced Punic magistrates, and Roman legions secured the coasts. The great city itself, once the jewel of the Western Mediterranean, was dismantled piece by piece. Streets were cleared of debris, but unlike the annihilation of some conquered cities, Rome spared the location itself. It rebuilt, not as a rival, but as a cog in its imperial machine. Roman administrators constructed grand roads connecting Carthage to other provincial centers, rebuilt ports to serve their naval fleets, and established military forts along key trade routes. Slowly, the Roman language, customs, and laws seeped into the soil like a creeping vine, claiming the land with quiet insistence. Yet beneath this Roman veneer, the old Punic world refused to die. Survivors and their descendants, scattered across the African countryside and nearby towns, preserved their ancient language in hushed tones. The rhythmic chants in Punic, the secret rituals at hidden shrines dedicated to Baal Hammon and Tanit, continued far from the watchful eyes of Roman officials. Mothers sang lullabies in the old tongue. Fishermen offered silent prayers to gods Rome did not recognize. The very earth seemed soaked with memories that refused to fade. The persistence of Punic culture was a thorn in Rome's side, but also a reminder of the city that had once dared to challenge the might of the Republic. In the marketplaces of the province, merchants of Punic descent controlled much of the trade. They sold olive oil, grains, and textiles, managing complex networks that reached across the Mediterranean, connecting distant ports from Carthage to Alexandria to Gades. Roman traders and settlers soon found themselves reliant on these Punic merchants. Rome's conquest had destroyed a city, but it could not erase centuries of commerce and expertise. Within the city of Carthage itself, now a Roman town with none of its former grandeur, remnants of the past coexisted uneasily with new structures of power. The famous harbors, once teeming with Carthaginian triremes, were restored by Roman engineers and used to project Rome's naval dominance. Marble temples and forums sprang up beside crumbled Punic altars, an architectural dialogue between conqueror and conquered. Roman visitors marveled at the ruins and heard whispered tales of Hannibal's daring feats and Carthage's glory. They collected fragments of inscriptions, coins stamped with Punic gods, and stories from elders who survived the siege. But their histories were always told through Roman eyes, a tale of civilization's victory over barbarism, of order imposed on chaos. Amid these uneasy layers, a new identity emerged, a blend neither fully Roman nor wholly Punic, but a hybrid forged from destruction and endurance. This transformation reflected a profound shift in Rome itself. Once a city-state obsessed with survival and defense, Rome now ruled an empire that spanned continents and encompassed countless peoples. The Republic had become a cosmopolitan force, forced to accommodate diversity, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with pragmatism. The Punic heritage, which had once been scorned as barbaric, became a resource. Punic artisans gained reputation for their skill in crafting fine pottery, glassware, and metalwork. Punic sailors, with centuries of knowledge of the Mediterranean's winds and currents, were indispensable to Roman trade and naval expeditions. Rome's pragmatic tolerance was born of necessity, but came with limits. Secret Punic rituals survived in shadows, but public displays were forbidden. Religious ceremonies were allowed only if they did not challenge Roman gods or authority. The province of Africa, rich and fertile, became one of Rome's breadbaskets. Vast estates, worked by slaves, many of whom were descendants of Carthage's former citizens or prisoners from other wars, produced grain and olive oil that fed the growing empire. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Local Berber tribes resisted Roman encroachment fiercely. Raids on Roman outposts and tax collectors were common, forcing Rome to station legions permanently across the region. Among the Punic population, resentment lingered. The pain of defeat, the loss of sovereignty, and the memory of Hannibal's daring campaigns were etched deep into family histories. Many spoke quietly of the day Carthage would rise again. of vengeance that might come with time. Rome's adoption of Punic military tactics and political lessons shaped its rise as well. Generals studied Hannibal's campaigns not only as a manual of warfare, but as a warning, a lesson in the perils of overconfidence and the power of flexible strategy. The wars had forced Rome to centralize power and adopt total war tactics. The destruction of Carthage was brutal and absolute, an example of the lengths Rome would go to secure dominance. The idea of unconditional surrender became embedded in Roman policy, fueling future campaigns in Gaul, Greece, and the East. Rome's growing empire also birthed new internal conflicts. Veterans returning from distant wars found no place at home. Land reforms championed by the Gracchi brothers sought to redress these imbalances, but their tragic deaths signaled the growing rift between Senate and people. In this crucible, Rome's transformation from republic to empire was forged. The Punic Wars, which had once been wars of survival, had become the foundation of an empire fueled by conquest and ambition. Yet the phoenix of Carthage continued to rise, not in armies or fleets, but in people. Some Punic families adapted, becoming Roman citizens, senators, and even military officers. Their Punic roots were concealed or blended with Roman identity. Their stories survived in inscriptions, letters, and family lore. The city itself, centuries later, would flourish again under the Roman Empire. By the time of Emperor Septimius Severus, Carthage was a center of culture, politics, and Christianity. The ancient city's name still carried weight, echoes of a once great rival that had challenged Rome's might and changed the course of history. Though Carthage's walls were broken, its spirit endured. The Punic Wars had ended, but their story was far from over. The ruins of Carthage had long been swallowed by sand and sea, but the echoes of its people, its culture, ambitions, and tragedies continued to ripple across the Mediterranean world. Rome's conquest had been total, but history showed that no victory is ever absolute. The spirit of Carthage lived on, woven into the fabric of the empire it once threatened, influencing societies in ways both subtle and profound. Rome, having grown from a city-state to the master of the Mediterranean, now faced the challenge of governing a vast and diverse empire. The Punic Wars had taught its leaders that power was fragile and that culture could be both a weapon and a bridge. The Carthaginian legacy, once feared and despised, became something Rome had to reckon with, not simply as a defeated enemy, but as a source of ideas, traditions, and unresolved tensions that refused to die quietly. In the bustling marketplaces and port cities of Africa, proconsularis, Punic merchants, and Roman traders met under the same roof, their voices mingling in a chorus of commerce and negotiation. The purple dye, once coveted by Carthage's nobility, extracted painstakingly from the murex sea snail, remained a luxury sought after by Roman senators and emperors alike. Its color symbolized wealth and power, and Roman dye workshops now employed many artisans whose ancestors had perfected this craft centuries before. Punic artisans blended their distinctive geometric designs, intricate motifs, and symbolic imagery with Roman styles. In the mosaic floors of villas and public buildings, one could find depictions of Roman gods alongside Punic symbols, stars, crescents, and sacred animals that spoke of a shared but complex heritage. Sculptors and painters, too, borrowed from both traditions, their work forming a cultural bridge between conquerors and conquered. Roman administrators sometimes found themselves fascinated by Punic knowledge, especially in fields such as navigation and engineering. Carthaginian sailors, who had once challenged Rome's dominance on the seas, were now prized as experts, guiding Roman fleets through treacherous waters. Punic engineers contributed to the construction of harbors and aqueducts, bringing centuries of experience to bear on Rome's ambitious infrastructure projects. Religion, often the most deeply rooted aspect of identity, became a subtle battleground and site of fusion. The old gods of Carthage, like Baal-Hamon and Tanit, did not vanish entirely, but were slowly assimilated into the Roman pantheon through syncretism. Baal-Hamon was equated with Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture and time. Tanit was linked with Juno or Venus. These identifications helped ease tensions, allowing both Romans and Punics to honor their deities under a shared religious umbrella. Private worship continued in secret, and the rites of the Punic faith persisted in hidden groves and shrines away from the official gaze. The elaborate rituals, sacrifices, and festivals, once celebrated openly, were relegated to the shadows, but remained vital to the identity of many Punic families. Oral traditions carried forward the stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors, connecting generations separated by conquest and exile. The political landscape of the Roman Empire was also shaped by the legacy of Carthage. Rome's expansion demanded a redefinition of citizenship and governance, a process that included the integration of former enemies. Some Punic families, through marriages and alliances, rose to prominence in the Roman provincial system. They adopted Roman names, embraced Roman customs, and served in local councils or even in the legions. The blending of Punic and Roman identities created complex social layers, with individuals negotiating their heritage in ways that could both preserve and obscure their origins. Yet resistance to assimilation remained. In rural areas, Punic-speaking communities maintained distinct cultural practices, and some chafed at Roman taxation and legal impositions. Periodic revolts erupted, fueled by a mixture of economic hardship, cultural pride, and distrust of imperial authorities. Roman governors and military commanders responded swiftly, often with harsh repression, maintaining a tenuous grip on the province. Beyond Africa, the Punic legacy influenced Rome's military and political culture profoundly. Hannibal Barca's campaigns remained a touchstone for military leaders. His audacity in crossing the Alps, his tactical brilliance at battles like Cannae, and his ability to inspire diverse armies served as lessons for Roman commanders for centuries. Military academies studied his maneuvers, and generals aspired to match or surpass his achievements. But the wars had also left Rome with a brutal lesson: that total war and absolute victory could demand unthinkable cruelty. The annihilation of Carthage became a dark precedent, justifying ruthless campaigns against other enemies and shaping Rome's imperial policies. This transformation fed the rise of powerful generals who commanded legions fiercely loyal to them rather than the Republic. The wars accelerated political fragmentation, as ambitious men used military success to gain power and challenge the Senate. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, and ultimately Julius Caesar all owed parts of their rise to the legacy of the Punic conflicts. Within Rome itself, the memories of the Punic Wars shaped society and politics in profound ways. The wars had revealed Rome's resilience and its capacity for sacrifice, but had also exposed social inequalities and political fragility. The veterans who returned from battlefields found their farms decayed or taken over by wealthy elites. Land reforms, championed by the Gracchi brothers, sought to address these problems but led to violent political turmoil and assassinations. The repeated cycles of civil war and political violence that followed bore the imprint of a republic grappling with the consequences of unprecedented expansion and the corrosive legacy of protracted warfare. Centuries after the fall of Carthage, the city itself rose again, this time as a major Roman metropolis and a center of early Christianity. Under the Severan dynasty, Carthage became a seat of culture, religion, and commerce. Its streets bustled with Roman citizens, Punic descendants, merchants, and priests, all weaving a new chapter in the city's long history. Archaeologists in later millennia would uncover layers of this complex past. Phoenician foundations beneath Roman temples, Punic inscriptions beside Christian mosaics, a testament to centuries of conflict and coexistence. Carthage's story did not end with its destruction, but continued through transformation, a reminder that civilizations may fall, but their legacies endure in ways both visible and hidden. The Punic Wars had ended, but their story was far from over. In the centuries following the ruin of Carthage, countless lives unfolded in the shadow of the Punic Wars. Not all of these stories were carved into the grand histories of empires and battles. Many were whispered in the quiet corners of marketplaces, passed down in hushed family traditions, or etched on crumbling tombstones long forgotten by time. This chapter journeys into the intimate struggles of individuals, men, women, and children, who lived caught between two worlds, carrying the legacy of both Rome and Carthage within them. The story begins in the twilight years of the 2nd century BCE in the rebuilt city of Carthage. Though the grand walls of old were reduced to rubble, life had returned. Roman officials administered the new province of Africa Proconsularis, while Punic descendants maintained a stubborn pride in their ancient heritage. Among them was Aelia, a young woman of 20 summers, born to a Punic family of modest means but fierce tradition. Her father, Hasdrubal, had been a merchant in the old city, surviving the sack but losing his wealth and status in the aftermath. He spoke to her often in the old Punic tongue, teaching her the songs, prayers, and stories of their people. Stories of ships that braved the seas, of gods who watched over the city, and of Hannibal Barca, the Lion of Carthage. Aelia's childhood was a dance of duality. By day, she attended Roman schools where Latin was spoken and Roman gods honored. Her lessons emphasized the glory of Rome's victories and the futility of resisting the Republic's might. By night, beneath flickering oil lamps, her family gathered for secret rituals in the old Punic fashion, invoking Baal-Hamon and Tanit, weaving traditions passed down through centuries. Her identity was a delicate tapestry, each thread a balance between loyalty and survival. When she came of age, Aelia was betrothed to Lucius Valerius, a young Roman officer stationed in the province. Their union was arranged to ease tensions between Roman settlers and the native Punic population, a political gesture meant to symbolize harmony. But it was more than politics that bound them. Lucius had grown up in Rome, far from the Mediterranean's southern shores, steeped in stories of Carthage's destruction and Rome's inevitable destiny. Yet when he arrived in Africa, he was captivated by the land's rugged beauty and haunted by the ruins that whispered of a proud civilization lost. At first, Aelia and Lucius struggled to bridge their worlds. She was wary of the conquerors, their Latin arrogance and dismissive attitudes. He was slow to understand the pain behind her reverence for a fallen city. But beneath the veneer of politics and war, a tentative love blossomed, built on curiosity, respect, and the hope that their union might forge a new future. They shared long evenings talking of their visions for a life that could unite rather than divide. Their children would grow up learning both languages, honoring both traditions, inheriting a blended legacy that refused to forget the past while embracing the present. Yet not all stories in Africa were as hopeful. In the fertile hinterlands lived Hannes, a stern Punic farmer whose family had tilled the same land for generations. The soil, rich with the sweat and blood of ancestors, was sacred to him. But Rome's triumph had upended everything. the sprawling estates of Roman patricians, worked by thousands of slaves captured from conquered lands, threatened to swallow his farm. Tax collectors demanded increasing tribute, and Hannes's pleas to local magistrates went unanswered. In village taverns and olive groves, murmurs of resistance grew louder. Hannes became a leader among those who refused to yield. He spoke of the Carthage that was, its naval power, its merchant fleets, its brave armies, and of the justice owed to those who had lost everything. Secret meetings were held under starlit skies, oaths taken to resist oppression. When a revolt erupted, Rome's legions marched swiftly. Hannes's village was razed, and many of its inhabitants were killed or enslaved. Hannes himself was captured and sold into slavery, destined to work in the very olive presses that had once sustained his family. Yet even in chains, he whispered stories of Hannibal's victories to fellow slaves, keeping alive the flame of hope in the darkest of places. Meanwhile, the city of Rome itself wrestled with its evolving identity. Marcus Claudius Severus, a senator descended from one of the Republic's oldest patrician families, sat in the marble halls of the Senate, deeply troubled by the changes sweeping the empire. A scholar and orator, Marcus had pored over accounts of the Punic Wars, studying Hannibal's tactics and mourning the lost opportunity for coexistence. He saw Carthage not only as a defeated rival, but as a mirror reflecting Rome's own vulnerabilities. To Marcus, the destruction of Carthage was both a strategic necessity and a moral tragedy. He believed the Republic could learn from its former enemy, that Carthage's commercial acumen, its cosmopolitan society, and its complex diplomacy held lessons Rome had ignored in favor of brute force. Marcus championed reforms aimed at bridging the growing social divide. He argued passionately for easing land ownership laws to aid veterans, for expanding citizenship rights to provincial peoples, and for greater tolerance of diverse cultures within the empire. His speeches invoked the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, but also called for a new vision, one capable of sustaining an empire of many peoples. His ideas, however, met fierce opposition. Conservative senators viewed his proposals as threats to their power and privileges. Rome's political life grew fractious, marked by violence and intrigue, as competing factions vied for control. Marcus's life would end tragically, the victim of assassination. But his vision persisted in the minds of reformers to come. Across the Mediterranean, countless others lived lives shaped by the legacy of Carthage and Rome's conquest. In ports and villages, Punic sailors who once served Hannibal found new roles within Roman fleets. Their knowledge of tides, stars, and hidden harbors was invaluable. Many adopted Roman names and customs outwardly, but whispered their own tales of glory beneath the waves. Merchants, skilled in the trade networks that connected Africa, Iberia, and the Italian peninsula, bridged cultures and economies. They dealt in olive oil, wine, pottery, and textiles, their caravans carrying both goods and stories between distant lands. In the religious sphere, priests and mystics navigated the tensions between old Punic cults and the ever-growing Christian faith, which would soon sweep across North Africa. Temples once dedicated to Tanit and Baal Hammon gradually gave way to churches, but elements of ritual and symbolism persisted in new forms. This was the human face of empire, not just triumph and defeat, but resilience and transformation. The legacy of the Punic Wars was not confined to the pages of history. It was alive in the tongues spoken at hearths, in the prayers whispered under moonlight, in the love between two people from different worlds, and in the silent resistance of those who refused to forget. The past and present intertwined, shaping identities as fluid and complex as the Mediterranean Sea itself. The Punic Wars had redrawn the map of the ancient world, not only through conquest and destruction, but by reshaping the very networks of trade, diplomacy, and culture that defined the Mediterranean basin. What had once been a contested sea, divided between rival powers, slowly evolved into a vast and interconnected system under Roman hegemony. The legacy of Carthage, though crushed beneath Rome's boots, continued to shape the flow of goods, ideas, and people for centuries to come. Long before Rome's rise, Carthage had been the linchpin of Mediterranean commerce, a maritime powerhouse that controlled crucial trade routes linking Africa, Europe, and the Near East. Its merchants plied the waves with fleets that transported spices, metals, textiles, and luxury goods, wealth that had funded its wars and built its cities. With Carthage's defeat and absorption into the Roman Empire, the Republic inherited these vital networks. Roman governors and merchants took up the mantle, expanding trade to unprecedented scales. But they did not merely replicate Punic commerce, they transformed it. Roman roads and ports integrated former Carthaginian territories with Italy and other provinces. The Mediterranean became what the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, a symbol of Rome's claim to dominion and unity. In this new order, Africa Proconsularis emerged as a cornerstone of Roman economic might. Its fertile fields produced grain that fed the ever-growing populations of Rome and its cities. Olive oil, wine, and exotic goods flowed along Roman roads from bustling harbors to inland towns. Yet beneath the Roman signage and architecture, Punic traders and artisans continued to ply their crafts. The ancient cities of Utica, Hippo Regius, and Hadrumetum thrived as cultural and economic centers, blending Punic heritage with Roman innovations. The Mediterranean economy grew more complex and interconnected than ever before. Merchants traveled farther, ships grew larger, and trade goods diversified. This prosperity, however, also exposed new vulnerabilities. Piracy, corruption, and political rivalries over control of key trade hubs became persistent challenges. Diplomacy, too, was transformed by the legacy of the Punic Wars. Rome learned early that direct military conquest was not always the best or only tool of empire. Instead, Rome often preferred to establish client kingdoms and alliances that acted as buffers against hostile powers. The fall of Carthage shifted the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. Numidian kings, once allies of Carthage, now aligned with Rome. The delicate dance of allegiance and rebellion in North Africa became a constant theme in Roman foreign policy. Farther east, Rome's attention turned to Hellenistic kingdoms like Macedonia, Pergamon, and Egypt, lands with their own complex relationships to Carthage's former influence. Rome's ability to navigate these intricate diplomatic waters owed much to lessons learned during the Punic conflicts. Culturally, the Punic legacy found surprising new life in Roman art, literature, and religion. Roman poets such as Ennius and later Virgil referenced Carthage and its doomed queen Dido, whose tragic story was immortalized in the Aeneid. Though Rome's official histories painted Carthage as a villain, the city and its people fascinated Roman audiences, inspiring tales of heroism, tragedy, and fate. In religious practices, syncretism blended Roman and Punic deities, creating hybrid cults that persisted even as Christianity began to spread in North Africa. Temples of Tanit and Baal-Hamon gave way to basilicas and churches. But echoes of Punic symbolism survived in local customs and art. Yet, beneath the prosperity and cultural exchange, old tensions simmered. Local populations in North Africa often felt the weight of Roman rule keenly. Taxation, land dispossession, and cultural imposition bred discontent. Periodic revolts, such as those led by the Berber tribes, reminded Rome that conquest was never complete and that the legacy of resistance endured. Trade rivalries and political intrigue at imperial courts also reflected the ongoing complexity of governing such a diverse realm. The Punic Wars had ended one chapter of conflict, but their consequences reverberated through centuries of Mediterranean history. The Mediterranean, once a battleground between Rome and Carthage, had become a stage for empire, an interconnected world of commerce, culture, and power, where the legacy of the Punic Wars was ever present. As the centuries unfolded after the devastating Punic Wars, the Mediterranean basin was transformed into a sprawling mosaic of cultures, ambitions, and conflicts. Rome, once a city-state threatened by a rival on its doorstep, had emerged as the uncontested master of the sea. Yet the echoes of Carthage's legacy continued to reverberate, shaping not only the fate of lands and peoples, but also the very soul of Roman civilization. Rome's triumph over Carthage came at a profound cost, and the scars left behind would influence its future for generations. The Republic found itself increasingly challenged from within. The prolonged wars had expanded Rome's territories far beyond its traditional borders, introducing vast new populations and complex governance challenges. The political system, designed for a city-state, strained under the weight of empire. The struggles between the Senate and the rising class of military generals intensified, often ignited by the specter of Hannibal, a symbol of military genius and near defeat for Rome. The fear that Rome might suffer such a catastrophe again made political factions wary and desperate for control. Figures such as Gaius Marius, a military reformer who opened the legions to the landless poor, and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a ruthless dictator who marched on Rome itself, were products of this turbulent era. Their rise was a direct consequence of the militarization and political upheaval catalyzed, in part, by lessons learned from the Punic Wars. The wars also altered the nature of Roman military power. Before Hannibal's invasion, Rome's legions were organized largely by property class and social status. But Hannibal's tactical brilliance exposed vulnerabilities in Rome's traditional military methods. The Romans adapted, reforming the legions into a more professional and flexible fighting force. They integrated new technologies, strategies, and troop compositions, some inspired by their Punic adversaries. This evolution made the legions more formidable, but also more personally loyal to their commanders than to the Senate or people of Rome. The seeds of civil war were sown in this dynamic, which eventually culminated in the end of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. In the provinces, especially Africa Proconsularis, the cultural landscape was equally complex. The city of Carthage, rebuilt under Roman supervision, transformed into a thriving metropolis, blending Punic, Roman, and Berber cultures. Roman architects erected grand forums, baths, and amphitheaters alongside remnants of Punic temples. Streets buzzed with merchants from diverse backgrounds, selling goods from across the empire and beyond. North Africa became a crucial supplier of grain and olive oil, feeding Rome's swelling population and armies. Large estates, worked by slaves and tenant farmers, dotted the fertile lands. These estates belonged mostly to Roman elites, many of whom had acquired property confiscated from former Punic landowners. Yet beneath the surface prosperity, old resentments simmered. Local Berber tribes, fiercely independent and proud of their heritage, resisted Roman rule through frequent raids and rebellions. Punic descendants, though more assimilated, still preserved their language, religion, and customs in private. The tension between adaptation and resistance defined much of North African life. Religiously, the region became a crucible of change. Christianity, which began as a small sect in Judea, spread rapidly across the Mediterranean and found fertile ground in North Africa. The early church fathers, including luminaries such as Tertullian and Saint Augustine, were deeply influenced by both Roman intellectual traditions and local cultural contexts, many of which had Punic roots. Though many Punic deities were supplanted, echoes of their symbolism persisted, weaving into the emerging Christian practices in subtle ways. The persistence of old beliefs alongside new faiths created a rich religious tapestry. Across the Mediterranean, Rome's dominance brought new diplomatic and economic realities. The defeat of Carthage left a power vacuum that Rome filled not only with military garrisons, but with strategic alliances and client kingdoms. Numidia, once an ally of Carthage, became a key Roman partner, its kings acting as buffers against hostile tribes. Rome's diplomacy extended eastward, engaging with Hellenistic kingdoms such as the Seleucids and Ptolemies, managing complex rivalries through a mixture of force, marriage alliances, and political subversion. Trade flourished in this relative peace, with goods from as far away as India and Egypt moving through Mediterranean ports. Roman roads and sea routes facilitated unprecedented connectivity. Yet these vast networks were also vulnerable to piracy, corruption, and political intrigue, challenges Rome addressed with varying degrees of success. Culturally, the Punic Wars left a lasting impression on Rome's identity. The story of Carthage was told and retold, often through a Roman lens that painted the city as a treacherous enemy. Yet Roman literature and art also betrayed a fascination, sometimes bordering on admiration for their fallen rival. The tragic figure of Dido, the Queen of Carthage, inspired poets like Virgil to weave tales of doomed love and fate, blending history with myth. Military leaders studied Hannibal's campaigns as the epitome of strategic genius and cautionary example. His bold crossing of the Alps became legendary, a symbol of daring and the dangers of underestimating a foe. This cultural memory shaped Roman military doctrine, political discourse, and even popular entertainment for centuries. The Punic Wars also had subtle but profound effects on Rome's social fabric. The influx of wealth and slaves from the conquered territories altered economic structures. The rise of large estates, often worked by enslaved peoples, contributed to the decline of small Roman farmers and the growth of urban plebeian classes. Social tensions escalated, leading to reforms and revolts that marked the late Republic. The wars taught Rome that total domination came at a cost, not only in gold and blood, but in the soul of the Republic itself. The political struggles that followed, from the Gracchi brothers' reforms to Caesar's dictatorship, bore the imprint of this lesson. Even as the Roman Empire expanded and evolved, the ghosts of Carthage haunted its margins. In art, literature, religion, and politics, the Punic legacy remained a powerful undercurrent, sometimes suppressed, sometimes celebrated, but never forgotten. The story of Carthage became a lens through which Romans understood themselves, their virtues, their vulnerabilities, and their destiny. As the Mediterranean entered the imperial era, the lessons of the Punic Wars continued to resonate. They shaped the governance of provinces, the ambitions of generals, the spread of cultures, and the everyday lives of millions who lived between worlds. The Punic Wars stand as one of the most pivotal chapters in the annals of ancient history. Conflicts that were not merely about territorial conquest or military glory, but about the very survival and transformation of civilizations. From the narrow streets of Rome to the sun-scorched shores of Carthage. The war raged with ferocity and resolve, leaving behind a legacy that would shape the Mediterranean world and beyond for millennia. Rome's victory over Carthage was total and decisive, yet the consequences of the wars extended far beyond the immediate destruction of a rival city. The Punic Wars forged Rome's transformation from a regional power into a sprawling empire, stretching from the windswept coasts of Hispania to the deserts of Africa and the rich lands of the eastern Mediterranean. This transformation was as much cultural and political as it was military. The Republic's institutions, designed for a smaller state, were strained under the weight of new territories and peoples. The repeated demands for armies, the influx of wealth and slaves, and the political ambitions of military leaders fueled social tensions that would ultimately dismantle the Republic. The Punic Wars had sown the seeds of both Rome's greatness and its internal strife. Hannibal's invasion had shaken the foundations of Rome, exposing vulnerabilities that Rome addressed through reforms and innovations in military organization and governance. But these changes came at a cost. Armies grew loyal to their generals more than to the Senate. Wealthy elites amassed vast estates worked by slaves, displacing small farmers and igniting social unrest. Figures such as Marius and Sulla, Julius Caesar and Pompey would all rise in the shadow of these transformations. Military men whose careers and ambitions would reshape Rome's political landscape and ultimately lead to the end of the Republic. Yet while Rome's political evolution was tumultuous, the cultural and social consequences of the Punic Wars were profound and enduring. Carthage, the once great city of Phoenician origin, known for its wealth, maritime skill, and fierce resistance, was destroyed physically, but not spiritually. Its people, language, religious practices, and customs did not vanish overnight. Instead, through a process of adaptation, resistance, and syncretism, Punic identity endured in the Roman provinces of North Africa. The cities that rose on Carthage's ashes became centers of trade, art, philosophy, and religion, blending Roman, Punic, and indigenous Berber influences into a rich tapestry. The early Christian church flourished here, with thinkers such as Tertullian and Augustine drawing on the diverse cultural legacies of the region. The Mediterranean Sea, once a contested battlefield between Rome and Carthage, gradually became a unifying artery of trade, culture, and exchange. Roman roads, harbors, and fleets knit together the far-flung corners of the empire. Goods from Egypt's grain fields, Spain's silver mines, and the forests of Gaul traversed the sea, enriching urban centers and fueling economies. Along with material wealth, ideas, religions, and artistic styles flowed freely, bridging differences and fostering new hybrid cultures. Yet despite this interconnectivity, the legacy of the Punic Wars persisted as a cautionary reminder. Beneath the veneer of empire lay deep divisions, tensions between conquerors and the conquered, and the fragile nature of power built on subjugation. The Punic Wars also cast a long shadow on Roman military doctrine and political thought. Hannibal's tactical brilliance remained a benchmark for generals who followed. His daring crossing of the Alps, his ability to unite diverse forces, and his strategic ingenuity inspired admiration and fear. Roman commanders studied his campaigns, learning both how to defeat such an adversary and how to avoid the mistakes that allowed him to penetrate so deeply into Roman territory. Politically, the wars underscored the dangers of internal discord and the importance of unity, a lesson etched painfully into the history of Rome as factions struggled for control, sometimes at the cost of the Republic itself. Beyond Rome and Carthage, the wars shaped the very concept of empire and the nature of Mediterranean civilization. They were a testament to the clash between competing visions of power, the maritime mercantile empire of Carthage and the land-based Republic of Rome. The wars illustrated how economic interests, cultural identity, military innovation, and political will intersected to determine the fate of peoples. They also revealed the human cost of empire, the suffering of soldiers and civilians, the destruction of cities, and the displacement of peoples. The scars left on the land and memory of those who lived through these wars remind us that history is not just a record of rulers and battles, but a mosaic of human experience. Looking through the lens of history, the Punic Wars resonate as more than ancient conflicts. They are enduring stories of ambition, resilience, adaptation, and consequence. They teach us about the complexities of cultural identity in times of upheaval, the intricate dance between war and diplomacy, and the profound ways in which conflict shapes societies long after the last sword is sheathed. Today, the ruins of Carthage stand as silent witnesses to this legacy, layered with centuries of human endeavor, from Phoenician settlers to Roman conquerors, from Byzantine fortifications to Islamic scholars. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, the echoes of the Punic Wars continue to shape how we understand power, culture, and history. Thus ends our journey through the Punic Wars, a story of empires clashing, civilizations transforming, and the enduring human spirit that lies at the heart of history. May the lessons of this saga continue to inform and inspire those who seek to understand the past and navigate the future.